else could you be other than holding a gun?
Hmm. Well, that was a particularly interesting event because of the work that we do. I know how it is that police carry out what they call hard stops or box stops. And I was driving along the motorway, and suddenly I saw a police car racing, lights flashing, everything, waiting for it to go past me. It didn't. It just sort of pulled in behind me. Then I saw another police car coming in the middle lane. By this time, I thought, this is a bit odd. Let me move into the slow lane, middle lane, and come up to my shoulder. And I thought to myself, well, if a further car comes in front of me, it'll be me they're interested in. And as we were driving along, I saw on the flyover that we were just passing, where people join the next the motorway, another police car racing down, come down in front of me. So I rolled my window down and said, would you like me to stop? And then I got this sort of like loudspeaker coming from the car, just follow the lead car. That was how I ended up getting stopped at some services because they thought I was carrying a gun.
Yeah. As I say, Kevin, we always found that story amusing. I suspect it wasn't at the time for you, but by way, as I say, for me, Kevin it made the life of Chambers, especially my old Chambers. I thought getting into those chambers as opposed to a fancy mainstream chambers was probably the best thing I ever had in my career. It was actually a very good grounding because it's introduced me to a culture, which I was saying to listeners last week, which I would have never imagined being introduced. And the reason why Kevin is interesting is because, as is often the case certainly in the Mediterranean basin and Africa, you have families that are culturally and religiously intermixed. And you have a Muslim side to your family, so you're quite familiar with Islam. And my enduring memory, I think, of the work you and I used to do is the fact that how easily you slotted in when you came to visit my family. And, you know, my mother is the most difficult mother there is. But, you know, she always looked at you.
I don't agree with that. But then she didn't raise me. I think she did a good job, by the way. Must have been difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. But she always used to say, you know, why can you not be like Kevin, so polite?
Oh, dear. I'm so sorry.
So by way of introduction, Kevin is a barrister, a senior counsel. I think probably is a lot more competent, and I don't say that simply because you're on the show. I say it because I genuinely believe it, than many a Queen's Counsel that have made it up to become silks and have had their applications accepted. He's a fighter, and he always fought for his cases from the heart, because he's the consummate professional who actually hated losing. Many a judge probably on the circuit, including Birmingham, didn't like that because they were always more enamored with people who kowtowed to them, but Kevin certainly wasn't going to do that. He was actually a person whose main priority was to actually do the best for his client, as opposed to try and keep judges or even juries happy. And that's what made him, for me, a special person, to the extent that I think you and I had a common, shall we say, judge who disliked us both, because he always had the opinion that, who used to sit in court for in Birmingham, because he thought I was your pupil. And this is where prejudices come in, you know. He thought, you know, this guy, he's equally, shall we say, feisty. He must be Kevin's pupil. I don't like Kevin, therefore I don't like Osama. But yeah, tell us about your experience, in particular how it was, certainly in the early 80s when you first came to the bar, how it was being a member of the ethnic minority, a West African, trying to get ahead and become a barrister, and a successful one at that.
Well, thank you, Ozzy. Can I just say first of all, thank you for the very wonderful comment you made about my status and having been in this profession for such a long time. This year will make me 37 years. I don't claim to be better than anybody else. I am me. It was a very nice comment, but the powers that be make their decisions based on applications that are put before them. I don't, at this stage, question them. But what it's like, what it's been like coming to the bar. Well, the first thing is getting pupillage. Quite apart from all the qualifications, the exams, passing the bar finals, I think as they were then, getting a seat in chambers or pupillage that will hopefully lead to a seat has always been difficult. I think it's even more so now for people maybe who do not have the right background or the right connections, don't fit into the boxes because there are less pupillages available. But even back then, in sort of 1984, I was looking for pupillage. I was looking for pupillage and sort of a little bit before actually I had actually passed the bar exams. And I was very fortunate that my parents knew people who were able to convince a set of chambers or a particular pupil master to take me. And I will always be grateful to Indra Kulatelika, who was my pupil master at One Gray's Inn Square, because he not only took me on, he realized that there were lots of problems that I would face because I didn't fit into the boxes. And he gave me some backbone and he gave me the strength to stand up for what I believe in. It was strange in the early days because I would go into court. I think this is common knowledge now, and apparently it's still happening. I would walk into a court, particularly magistrate's court, as a young barrister. This was even after pupillage. As a young barrister who'd been taken on, I've fast forwarded about a couple of years now. And the first thing that would happen is I'll be ushered into the dock. Fully suited and booted, as the saying goes. But when you were asked what case you were there for, they automatically assumed that you were the defendant. It happened on too many occasions to mention. But my mantra was always that I was going into a profession that was regarded as very highbrow. My father was a barrister in Sierra Leone, which is where I grew up. He taught me respect for people and one thing. If you're going to succeed, don't try to be as good as the next person. Be 10 times better than them. So I've always tried to be 10 times better, to prove myself 10 times over so that I could be accepted, so that I could work in the profession that I chose.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important lesson because there are unfortunately many members of the ethnic minority who see obstacles put in front of them, who simply give up and they say, you know what, the system is against us. Mm. But again, I, like you, took the view that I had to prove myself. I used that as an incentive to better myself as opposed to just become disheartened. And effectively, if you become disheartened and you give up, then the system has won.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. It's quite an interesting one, actually, you say, because, of course, those were the early 80s, the days of Toxteth, Brixton, Handsworth. They were completely different. I don't think the young generation realizes the achievement the likes of yourself, Dominic Roberts, Wilfred Forster Jones, had actually made to make it onto that ladder in those days. I mean, look, I think you probably know because it was actually the story in Chambers as to how I got in and how Dominic actually called me up for an interview. Dominic, being the entrepreneurial person, had a bet with Denora, of course. And the first question was, do you know anyone in Freetown, Sierra Leone? But, we'll get Dominic to explain that story. And it was a stroke of luck. And it's kind of bizarre because it came a week after I had a phone call from a joint head of chambers in 1 Middle Temple Lane, who told me that my CV was very impressive, but I should look for a change of career because I was never going to make it as a barrister at the bar because I was an Arab. And the stroke of luck, being an Arab actually, and being born in Lebanon, that was that sort of element of fate which actually got me to join your chambers in London. And then the mindset, quite interestingly, you always have that mindset as an ethnic minority that they expect you actually to be a foreigner. I think you remember, God rest his soul, Judge Scott from up in Bradford, the character.
I don't remember all the judges' names, but some do stand out, yes.
And in fairness, first time I went to Bradford, I think I was covering a case for you on a matter in Bradford, either for you or for Latif. And Judge Scott, he says, we have a foreigner in court. Mr. Daneshyar, where are you from? I said, I was born in Lebanon, Your Honor. And God rest his soul, actually, he didn't mean it that way. He goes, no, I want to know which chamber you're in. Yeah. So we always sometimes, not knowing the characters that they were, we used to probably take things not in their right context. But so we had to be careful in the way we actually perceived certain actions to be. Because sometimes you can get into a siege mentality, which I think for you, that wasn't an issue. You actually could read people quite well. You could see who was being difficult because he had judgitis and who had a difficulty because he had difficulty for you having a certain different attitude onto life as you would expect from your background. And as you remind the listeners, yes, it was a very highbrow profession. And I think it's not so much now, but I think the thanks goes to the likes of you and Dominic and the others, including Latif and Balbir, who
people
actually...
like John Roberts as well.
Absolutely, John Roberts.
QC of blessed memory, yeah.
Yeah. Who were really the leaders in breaking that sort of glass ceiling that there was for ethnic minorities at the bar.
Yeah.
And I think you...
Well, let me give you a story. I told you my pupil master, Indra Kulatilaka. He came from Sri Lanka. He was a very cultured man, very measured, and his English was impeccable, but he had an accent. We appeared in court. I was co-defending with him in Harrow. The judge shall remain nameless. But so Mr. Kulatilaka, Indra was addressing the court. And after about 30 seconds, the judge said, I can't understand you. And this went on for about 10 minutes. And I was really angry about it because this man could put together better English than most of the barristers who were in that court building. The only thing was he had an accent. And I thought the judge was being particularly difficult and making his life miserable because he had an accent. I won't tell you what I did, but I was really, really angry with it. But these are little instances of things that sometimes make you sit back and think, why are we in this business, and why is it that people will find any excuse to pick at you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were in the business because we wanted to do what was right, and I think, which brings me quite nicely onto the case that you led me on, and it was quite an achievement, actually, which was the case of Nasser Abid Khan, the former SAS officer who suffered a campaign of racial discrimination in the army, stretching back to the mid-1980s, all the way through the first Gulf War, where he was an SAS officer.
He was a bombardier in the first Gulf War.
Absolutely, fighting for the liberation of Kuwait.
Yeah.
And I think we had difficulty whereby we were trying to show that the new laws which allowed to bring proceedings in the employment tribunal were applicable to this particular case. So you can take us through, you can take the listeners through as to how we actually managed to do that, Kevin, and it was quite a clever ploy.
It was interesting because I think it had been for 2 or 3 years permissible for members of the defense service, so soldiers, to bring an action against their employers, the Ministry of Defense. But of course, with the employment tribunal, there are strict time limits, and the case was you had to have brought your cause of action within 6 months of it taking place. But you had to go through your grievance procedures. And the grievance procedures within the Ministry of Defense, certainly at that time, took you well beyond the 6 months. So when we first filed the case, and I think we got involved at the stage where the solicitor had filed the case before we got involved, so we had to amend the pleadings. What we did was looked at the objection that came immediately from the Ministry of Defense, because they were just taking technical objections, trying to get the case kicked out so it wouldn't be heard. Bear in mind, an employment tribunal is a public forum, and members of the public would be able to go in and listen to what Mr. Khan would be saying about how badly he had been treated. And, you know, by way of example, some of the things that he said, which I think we can mention on a clean show like this, is he was called a raghead. He was told to go and get a cup of tea, you know, because it's about the same color you are, and various other things, I think, which are far less pleasant.
In fact, he was told, sorry to cut across you. In fact, he was told at one stage, you're actually on the wrong side. Go the other side of the trenches. You should be with the Iraqis.
And that was when he was in actually fighting for on the British side in the Gulf War in Desert Storm, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean that we had all these things that he could say, and the Ministry of Defense wanted to cut it off. They sent high-powered counsel to try and cut it off. And I think you and I sat down, looked at this, and decided, well, the only way we could do this was to treat what had been happening to him as a course of continuing conduct. So we got, if I remember correctly, the case of Caston Croydon Colleges, and likened the course of action, the treatment that Mr. Khan had been receiving over time, taking it way beyond into the grievance procedures itself, the lax way in which we believed that his case had been handled, and the offhand manner in which it had been responded to over a period of time. And we argued that the treatment that he was complaining of was continuing to the day that we made the application, because he was still, of course, in the army.
Yeah, and it was a stroke of luck because, of course, post entry of that particular law that came into force, he received a poison pen letter through the letterbox, which actually continued the act.
Yes.
And I think there, the issue for the Ministry of Defense was actually trying to keep what had taken place to Nasser Abed Khan out of the public arena.
Absolutely. And he received some interest in the mainstream press. I was some time ago, I was just looking through some of the work that I'd done, and I came across an article, I think it was in October, in The Independent, talking about the treatment and so on. So this would have been in or around October 1999, before we had actually managed to get the case on its legs. And I think I'm right in saying that this was the first time in any case anyone had succeeded in bringing a case before the employment tribunal and not being knocked down by the technical objection put forward by the Ministry of Defense.
Yes, and again, that reflects, I think, the culture that we had in Three Temple Gardens, and certainly before that, I think you were at Middle Temple Lane,
Yes.
that particular set of chambers, where it was important to fight for your own, not forgetting your own background or where you came from. And I think Nasser was turned away by many a lawyer who thought, one, he had no case, but two, he didn't really have that much money to pay. And I think both yourself and Tasneem Usmani, the solicitor who took it on, they took it on out of principle rather than a means of trying to make money out of it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Just to right what was wrong. We're coming up shortly to a break, Kevin. I'd just like to remind the viewers, if you'd like to join in or you have any questions for Kevin, there is two phone numbers you can call, 0116 4822 086. That is if you want to ask a question directly to Kevin. Or alternatively, you can text on 0774 8855 055. Before we come to the break, I would like you to think over the break about, shall we say, instances of judges giving you a hard time, which you may have thought were not particularly as a result of your own competence, but maybe you just didn't fit in the stereotype of what an English barrister ought to be. And also the good judges who were actually very receptive, because I always used to find that for every one judge who was particularly troublesome, there were 10 who were actually very wonderful and very accepting, and you know, and when you walk into court, went completely against what our own prejudices were when looking at them at first hand. You know, you look at the judge and you think, oh my God, he's going to be severe. He probably hasn't ever seen an Arab in his life, but they turned out to be very, very generous and extremely polite and welcoming judges. So if you can give that some thought whilst we cut into the short break. Okay. Welcome back, listeners. You're listening to Ramadan Radio. It's 87.9 FM. With us is Kevin Metzger. Kevin is, as introduced earlier, a senior counsel, practicing barrister. He was called to the bar, I believe, in 1983. 1984. And he's now currently in, deputy head of chambers of Great St. James Street. And I think you're there. The head of chambers is Mr. Alan Jones QC.
That's correct.
They're probably one of the foremost extradition specialists in the UK.
That's right.
In fact, even to this day, on extradition cases that I have, whether I'm actually requesting extradition or even fighting extradition, I still use his book.
Jones on extradition.
Miles away. But yeah. Kevin, just before the break, I think we were mentioning how sometimes we can interpret judges' questions to questions in relation to perceived what judges say. And I think the question I was asked once in Bradford Crown Court by His Honour Judge Scott, God rest his soul, was, we have a foreigner in court, where I was from, and my response was I was born in Lebanon, which I took it completely wrong, because foreigner, he meant I wasn't from either Bradford or Leeds chambers, and I'd actually come out of town, from Birmingham at the time. And interesting story about Judge Scott, because he was quite a character. He was a genuine judge who often, as a typical Yorkshireman, he spoke what he meant, and he meant what he said. Honest and very, very approachable and affable. People used to think sometimes he was difficult, but he wasn't actually. And the story about Judge Scott is, may he rest in peace, was when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, given 2 months to live. He'd always had a dream of becoming a cab driver to get to know the people of Bradford better. And actually, when he was diagnosed, he came into court, he picked up his artfold, and then lived his last months of his life as a minicab driver in Bradford. And it's quite a touching story, because it just goes to show that everyone has their own dreams. Sometimes they may not achieve it for whatever reason. He achieved a much greater feat, but that was ultimately what his dream was, and he fulfilled it in the last days of his life. Now, getting back to our chat in terms of what sometimes you had perceived to be, shall we say, unexplained difficulties from judges. You gave us an example of Indra's experience in Harrow Crown Court. What was your personal experience? You said at the beginning, when you were going to the magistrate's court, they thought many occasions that you were defendant. As things progressed, did that sort of prejudice persist, or did it wane over time?
I think it's always difficult to say, and one must try to be as objective as possible, because, as you say, there comes a time when you're faced with what you consider all this negativity. You tend to compartmentalize that into one box and say, it's because I'm different, it's because I'm black, it's because I'm whatever it is. And that's very easy to do when you're under pressure. So I think the best way of looking at it is maybe taking 2 or 3 examples of situations and leaving the listener to assess what it is they think of what you're saying or what you thought, because I may be completely wrong. Funny enough, in the same case I was doing with Indra at Harrow Crown Court, I was very friendly with the judge's clerk. And as you know, we fight hard for our clients. One day, the clerk called me into a corner and said, I need to talk to you, I need to talk to you. She was obviously very, very distressed. And I said, what's the matter? She said, you won't believe what the judge just said to me. He just said, I'd rather be sentencing Mr. Metzger than his client. And well, obviously, I looked at that situation and I thought, well, I wonder what that means. And as I had to go off and finish off another case elsewhere, I needed to ask the judge's permission. So I asked to see him in chambers. I asked to see him in chambers. He invited me to a cup of tea. We spoke about it. I got what I wanted without once mentioning what the clerk had told me. But I suspect that she may have hinted to him that she may have slipped something to me, and he behaved better afterwards. Another instance, a judge you and I know both very well, and I think you referred to in the past. I was in Birmingham Crown Court. I think it was called for in the middle of making a submission in respect of a case of armed robbery. Half-time submission to say that the prosecution didn't have a case. It was built on inferences and so on and so forth. And in the middle of that submission, the judge said, as we say, sotto voce, so very softly, hope springs eternal. Well, by the time he got to the al of eternal, I sat down. And he said, Mr. Metzger, you were in the middle of your submission. And I said, well, I heard what Your Honor said. And of course, everything in court is recorded, was recorded even at that time. I said, I heard what Your Honor said and thought there was no point continuing to waste Your Honor's time. And I think he was very embarrassed. He then said, but you've got a submission on abuse of process, which, as you know, is a continuing thing. Once you put in an application to stay proceedings for an abuse of process, the court is entitled to continue looking at it. And he said, well, would you like to make that now? And I said, well, actually, no, Your Honor. In fact, I'd like a break. Well, yes, of course, Mr. Metzger. I said, I'd like to use the restroom. And he allowed me to go and use the restroom. I came back and then I made my submission, which failed. But here's an instance where, take it whichever way you like, the judge was clearly not listening to the submission I was making and found it necessary to make a comment. Or maybe he was thinking it and just said it aloud. That's one particular situation.
I mean, sorry. I mean, I had similar experiences with that particular judge. I like to give him the benefit of the doubt, and I always say the reason why he disliked me was because he thought I was your pupil. I had a number of run-ins with him. On one occasion, when there was a Muslim witness, just to put the witness at ease, I actually said "Salaam alaikum" as a greeting, and there was a very loud shout saying, Mr. Daneshyar, we speak English in this court. And politely I said, well, Your Honor, I thought certainly in this era, past millennium, Britain had become diverse enough for the jury and the others, including the witness, to understand what actually is quite a pleasant greeting is, which is Salaam alaikum. I'm telling her, peace be upon you. I mean, that cannot be anything bad. And on another occasion, actually, I remember covering a matter on behalf of Balbir, of murder, and we were trying to organize things. And I was actually in pain, I was ill. And he simply said to me, Mr. Daneshyar, this is not a game. And my reaction was, well, Your Honor, if it was, I wouldn't get out of my sick bed, barely capable of walking, standing here in pain in front of you, making these submissions for the interest of the defendant.
Yeah.
And again, politely responded to it. But I say, I'd like to give the judge the benefit of the doubt. Many a person actually noticed the way he would treat you and treat me. The case in front of him, I was there with two English lawyers, barristers, making equally competent submissions, he would not want to hear me, but the other lawyers, the colleagues who were co-defending for the co-accused, he would give them all the time of day. I say, it's unfortunate, you would come across it, and you have to deal with it in a manner which really keeps your own dignity, because it tends to show that they are in the wrong rather than you. Yeah. We were just simply trying to do, as you were on that day, trying to do your job. So again, carry on. Sorry for interrupting.
No, not at all. I mean, I think you've hit the nail right on the head there. We deal with instances which appear odd, however they were meant, and just try to get on with your job. I remember a particular instance, and that probably has nothing to do with my ability or who I am, but do you remember it was a trial in Leeds? It was a murder trial, and I think I was leading you. And we were in front of a judge who was very, very well regarded. He had made his name as a prosecutor, prosecuting one of the most notorious murderers in this country, and he'd gone onto the High Court bench. I was leading you because it was a case, obviously it was a conspiracy to murder, and I think there were about 13 defendants. We were defendant number 11.
Yeah, we were tail end Charlie virtually.
And everybody else had a QC and junior. And our poor client had Metzger and Daneshyar. And the judge would, as soon as I got up to ask questions, he would be very, very upset, visibly so, palpably so from our perspective. He would have a go at me, regardless of whatever happened. If a QC after us asked the same question, he would be very, very nice. And I remember we discussed this, and we thought, well, why is the judge behaving like this? And our instructing solicitor came to court one day, and he asked to see him in chambers. And afterwards, our instructing solicitor came back laughing, and we asked him what was the matter. And if you recall, the judge had asked him, why did you instruct this guy? Everybody else has got a QC. And the solicitor said, well, Judge, you've moved this case so much that the QC who was meant to do this case couldn't do it any longer. I couldn't get anybody else in who was good enough in time. That's why I got Mr. Metzger, who'd been junior in the case and knew the case very well, to lead. And we made an application for the representation order to be amended. And he said, well, he's just not quite got the wool on his back. I think you remember that conversation.
I remember that conversation.
And at the time, I was rather perturbed. There were times when he appeared bad-tempered. In fact, he commented on the state of my gown at the time, and I ended up buying a new gown.
Well, let's be honest, your gown was in tatters then. I mean, it was literally cut to shreds at the back.
That's right, as a result of all the fights, the legal fights I've been involved in. But anyway, thanks to that particular judge, I got a new gown. That was my second gown. I'm now on my third, which is also in tatters, by the way. And he sent his man, High Court judges always have somebody they call the judge's man, to come along and say, Mr. Metzger, I admire your attire. So I think it's a happy ending because at the end of the day, I got on well with him. I found out later on that he was married to somebody who was not English. And I had misinterpreted the way in which he was treating me or us as being related to who we were, as opposed to
the judge. He was actually he's a very decent man. He's a very, very open-minded judge. And in fairness, he was a traditionalist. He never expected a junior to lead on a murder. That was his biggest problem. Mm. And I remember once back in 2003, I was waiting to get on to be called at the Court of Appeal. He came across and he says, "Oh, Mr. Daneshyar, so good to see you." I said, "Likewise, my lord." He says, "Mr. Daneshyar, I've been hearing very good things about you. Keep up the good work." and he was a fair judge, and he appreciated skillful barristers. He had the misconception that to be skillful on a murder, you had to be QC, but eventually, remembering that particular dinner, he was as pleasant as anything with you. And unusually from his background, he enjoyed a glass or two of Chateau Moussa.
Yes, I remember. And of course, thinking about that dinner, do you remember all the other people were coming up and saying, "Oh, we're organizing this dinner. You're not going to want to come, are you?" Yes, of course. And I think attending that dinner with the judge, which is a traditional thing when you've been in a long, complex case, kind of allowed us to, on a personal basis, understand each other better, understand our backgrounds, and so on and so forth. And I got to understand that this judge, who was seemingly so harsh throughout the case, was actually quite complimentary of what we'd done, and was a thoroughly decent chap.
And I think he was also very fair on sentencing. I mean, he was the sort of person who had a reputation for being harsh. But I remember our client actually for a conspiracy to murder, I think got 7 years, and he'd been on license at the time as well.
Yes.
He was a very fair judge.
Yes, because if you remember, our client had some mental health issues, which we had great difficulty in getting out because with the strictures on legal aid, it took a while for our solicitor to get permission to get a clinical psychologist to see him and so on and so forth. But late in the day, though it was, he listened very patiently to that and dealt with our client in a very fair way. Yes.
Now that, I mean, I've been off the scene, I think now about 10 years, and I don't know how the bar has developed. I think it would help our listeners to just see, I mean, do you take the view things have got better in terms of standard of fairness? How has it developed? I mean, I've literally been disconnected. Yes. I don't really see that much. But for me, I think with certain laws being introduced, including the introduction of hearsay evidence, which I thought was a travesty, the way that character was coming in just to prove, in fact, shall we say, a propensity to commit offences that was brought in, which was previously prohibited. Things were on the slide, and I decided, with all the things that were going on at the bar, including the fact that we were no longer being treated as professionals, but simply as a very methodical kind of, shall we say, a production line type of profession, it was time to get out. But help our viewers and listeners as to what you think has happened to the profession as well as the justice system. Has it got for the better, or what is your view on it?
Well, I think that the justice system has suffered a lot because, as you know, in the United Kingdom, because I do purely criminal defense work, it's publicly funded. Most people, in fact, almost anybody charged with a criminal offense gets legal aid, unless it's not a criminal offense. And if you've got lots of money, they probably restrain your funds, so you have to be legally aided. The fees have been cut down significantly. Less money has gone into paying judges, keeping courts open, ushers, you will find in courts, but court clerks, some courts sit without a court clerk regularly. So justice has been straining, it seems to me. All these things that have been brought in seem to me to be an attempt to make sure that if a case comes to court, you get more convictions than acquittals, because otherwise it doesn't justify the justice model. And I think that's a wrong way of looking at it. We shouldn't be dealing with conveyor belt justice. It should be fairness, it should be fair for all. And the people that pass these laws and reforms and so on will never know unless they or one of their relatives one day finds themselves in that situation, a situation we deal with every day, that suddenly somebody can go and say, well, 3 years ago, actually, this person did something. And that is, although it's not a conviction, it's reprehensible behavior. We can use that against them. Taking away the right to cross-examine people because they are too vulnerable, even though the evidence they give, assisted by intermediaries and so on, puts your client in difficulty. I could go on, but time is short.
Yeah, time is short. And I think, unfortunately, the way the system is geared up, it does impact on ethnic minorities more than non-ethnic minorities. Because that is the nature of the work that we do.
Statistics speak for themselves.
Yeah. Kevin, thank you very much for taking out time of Saturday morning. I know you probably like to rest after a hard week. But again, I'd like to thank you on behalf of our listeners for joining us this morning.
Thank you for inviting me, Ozzy. It's been a pleasure sitting and spending time with you again.
Salam.
Salam.